Kentucky Lieutenant Governor Jackie Coleman announced her bid to become Kentucky's next governor. She served as Lieutenant Governor with Andy Beshear since 2019, and she's also a teacher. A recent column from the Bluegrass Institute evaluates her education policy record in a column titled, "Would Jackie Coleman Bring Sound Education Policy into the Governor's Office?" I'm Richard Nelson, and you are tuned into The Commonwealth Matters. And joining us to talk further about this is one of the authors of that column that I just mentioned, Gary Houchens. He's a personal friend and a friend of the Commonwealth Matters program. He's a scholar at the Bluegrass Institute and professor of education leadership at Western Kentucky University. Gary, welcome to the program.
Always great to be with you, Richard.
Hey, I always enjoy your perspective and insights. Just you're a bright guy, but also you've got a lot of experience when it comes to being in the classroom. You were a teacher, you were a principal, you're at the higher education level at Western Kentucky University, and just really appreciate your insights. And I thought, man, we need to get Gary back on the program. So here you are.
Love being back.
So Gary, public education, as you and I have talked about before, and as our listeners already know, it's a big issue for Kentucky voters. In Kentucky, educators do have a pretty big impact when it comes to public policy. The teachers union in particular has gotten involved with a number of elections. Few years ago, there was Amendment 2, the school choice, the EOA, Education Opportunity Account issue. It was defeated at the ballot box. And now here, and of course, they've gotten involved with the governor's race. They're big supporters of Governor Andy Beshear. I would guess they're going to be big supporters of Jacqueline Coleman, who is an educator, now running for governor. I want to, at the outset, just make a distinction here, something we talked about before we started recording, and that there really should be a distinction made between teachers in the classroom, those who are pouring their hearts out to kids, they're dedicated to teaching, they're dedicated to learning, distinguish between that and the education establishment, right? Where you have people that are not in the classroom necessarily, but you have administrators, policymakers at a high level where they're removed from the classroom. And it's important in the context of this conversation to distinguish between the two. So Jackie Coleman's running for governor, and that's the topic of your column. You say in this column that she's amenable to dismantling some regulatory barriers, education, employment, but her overall record raises a serious concern about the policies that she'd bring to the governor's office. So tell us about some of the barriers that she is in favor of eliminating. We'll start on a positive note here, right?
Yeah. So I think it's important to note that we're trying to extrapolate from comments that the lieutenant governor has made as to the areas in which she might be amenable to reform efforts. She supported a change in the GED system that would basically eliminate the fee that's associated with taking the GED. That was, in our judgment, a positive move that made it possible to increase educational attainment for the state of Kentucky, which is a great goal. And she's made comments to suggest that because part of her role, in addition to being the lieutenant governor, she also wears the hat of the Secretary of Education and Workforce Development. So she is also responsible for trying to promote workforce opportunities in the state. And she's indicated that there are bureaucratic barriers that may stand in the way of people entering into new occupations and advancing and developing the workforce. And so that's encouraging because Kentucky currently has one of the most onerous regulatory regimes when it comes to occupational licensing. So individuals who want to enter a new field of vocation, things like being a barber, for example, or running a hair salon, really terrible regulations that prevent people from being able to move into those kinds of careers, especially as an independent business owner. To the extent that she's amenable to making changes in those kinds of regulations, we find that encouraging on the education and workforce development front.
That's good. And that's positive. I think that when you see things that need to be fixed and when you have somebody running for office or somebody in office, a willingness to address that and to make the fixes is important. It's very easy to ignore problems. There are many, many challenges facing the Commonwealth. So those are some positive things, Gary. Moving on to another thing that you point out in the article is that she favors universal pre-K, which the governor has been promoting for years, stumping for it across the state, actually allocated some money for it to try some pilot programs. But you're saying in your column that there's studies out there that show that universal pre-K is actually does not show that it's worth the cost. Tell us more about universal pre-K.
Yeah, this is a issue that tends to be very popular if you just present the idea that we're going to create a program that will allow every family to access preschool for their children. But the reality of universal pre-K programs is that they are fabulously expensive, but yield really disappointing long-term results. And so we've had multiple studies conducted over the years, including a deep set of research around Tennessee's universal pre-K program, one that it generally is considered to be well structured. And those studies suggest that if you gain any positive benefit academically for students who participate in these pre-K programs, those benefits fade out by the time the students are in third or fourth grade. So they become indistinguishable from children who did not attend preschool. And so what that suggests to us is that universal pre-K, as nice as it sounds, is not a good investment in the future. Studies show that to do a preschool program properly, it would probably cost about $12,500 per student per year. And so implemented across the state of Kentucky, you're talking about millions and millions of dollars that the research suggests will not pay off in long-term educational outcomes for those students. And so if we were going to invest millions like this, it would behoove us to consider other types of investments that might yield a better outcome in the long run than universal pre-K. And Lieutenant Governor Coleman and Governor Beshear, neither of them have been willing to acknowledge or talk about the real data around universal pre-K. And so if this is an issue that they really want to promote from a policy standpoint, they're going to have to confront the data that suggests these programs don't pay off in the long run.
Gary, tell us more about these other alternatives that would be better investment for pre-K students. Do you, anything in particular? Can you point to anything?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most proven strategies for increasing student achievement, especially for students who are academically behind, is one-on-one tutoring programs. Those are not widely implemented because they are also extraordinarily expensive. But if you were going to invest millions of dollars in a strategy to try to promote higher student achievement, especially for those who are behind academically, your tutoring would be a much better investment than universal pre-K.
So you're talking tutoring once the child gets into kindergarten, first, second, third grade, you're talking about expanding K through 12 services to those students who are struggling.
That's correct. Yeah. And probably beyond the school day would be the logical structure for a program like that. I'm not necessarily advocating for that as an alternative. I'm just saying that's an example of a program that might be higher yield than universal pre-K.
Gary, if the data is clear, you mentioned Tennessee. I don't know if there are any other studies out there that show the efficacy of universal pre-K, but if the data is there, why would leaders push for a failed program? If it's clear that this is not going to be a success, that the results will fade away after a couple years after a student has enrolled in pre-K, why push for it?
Well, I think it sounds great. I think it makes for terrific sound bites that make it sound like you are really interested in promoting the welfare of students. Intuitively, parents and teachers even think, oh, well, if the students had that jump start on kindergarten, that would benefit them academically. They would come to me as a teacher in later grades, better prepared to do rigorous academic work. It sounds like something that you would naturally support, but in reality, I think this is a reflection of the desire on the part of many people in the educational establishment to just draw more students into the existing public education system. I think it would be a massive jobs program for preschool educators. It would lead to an expansion of the scope and power of the public education system, and I think that is more of the implicit goal of a program like this.
Yeah. And as it is, there are options out there. I think of in some of our bigger cities, there are pre-K private programs, right? Often through
Right.
churches or individuals that want to do it. What would something like this do to the private providers of pre-K?
Well, it depends on how it were structured. So in some
Mhm.
states, private providers can participate in these universal pre-K programs.
Okay.
In other states, they are restricted to sort of public school districts operating them. But what we find in places like Colorado, private preschool providers have been shut out of the universal pre-K programs there. Because the universal pre-K programs come with ideological requirements that a lot of faith-based
Mm.
preschool programs can't abide by.
Yeah.
And so it just winds up being a method of denying families access to pre-K programs that would actually match and reflect their own values.
Okay, very good. Gary, moving on, another thing you talked about in the column was that the state of Kentucky shifted from using the ACT for high school students to the SAT for state assessments. And you say in the column that this destroys the only continuous source of college readiness data that Kentucky has and may violate state law. So first of all, tell us what the previous framework was with the ACT. How long have Kentucky high schoolers been tested? How many high schoolers were tested? And what was the data saying about the ACT and
Yeah.
performance
So
levels? Yeah.
Right. So the ACT is the most widely used college readiness assessment in the United States, and Kentucky had used it as a part of its own assessment and accountability system for 18 consecutive years to provide one measure for how our high school students were doing and how well prepared they were for college and for careers. And it was an extremely important data point because it is independently designed and administered. The ACT was not subject to the continuous revisions and changes that the state assessment and accountability system perpetually goes through. And
Mm-hmm.
so we had an 18-year trend line to tell us how our students were doing on the ACT. And frankly, the news was not good. Our high school student performance on the ACT began to level off several years ago, prior to COVID, in fact, and has continued to decline. And so the data was not positive. And by abandoning the ACT, as the Kentucky Department of Education did, that trend line is now entirely wiped out. And of course, we'll be able to start building a new trend line with SAT data, which is what was chosen by the department to replace the ACT. But it will take years for us to really be able to establish what those trends actually are. And so in terms of having a solid metric for knowing how our high school students are doing, that has been completely eliminated. And the really troubling part of this is that the Kentucky Department of Education did that without a vote of approval from the Kentucky Board of Education, which is supposed to be its own governing body. And neither the board nor Lieutenant Governor Coleman, who is an ex officio participant in the Kentucky Board of Education, raised any alarm bells or questions about this process. It's also concerning because legally the state of Kentucky requires a science assessment at the high school level as a part of its assessment accountability, and the SAT does not. There are science items on the SAT, but the student performance on those items is not parsed out as a distinct science score. And so at the Bluegrass Institute, we have some real questions about the legality of using the SAT in this particular way.
Gary, you said that the state Board of Education did not make this change, which they're apparently the organization authorized to make such a change, such a major policy change. Who did make the change then? Is it Robbie Fletcher, the Commissioner of Education?
It was staff of the Kentucky Department of Education, who I have many previous experiences with, and are great individuals, terrific professionals. I'm sure they're trying to exercise what they think is best for the state in their judgment. But given the radical nature of this particular change, there should have been more oversight and questioning on the part of the Kentucky Board of Education. That's their number one job. And that did not happen in this particular case.
Gary, let's go back to the rationale for the switch. ACT, which has provided a continuum of 18 years of education performance data of our high school students. It included the scientific portion, which by law, Kentucky students, high school students we need to find out how they're performing with science. No longer that is the case. What was the rationale for the move? Why move from the ACT to the SAT?
Richard, personally, I haven't seen a good rationale provided on the part of the Kentucky Department of Education. Maybe in their internal communication, there was some rationale, some better rationale presented for that. Of course, the SAT is also a longstanding and well-respected metric of college readiness. Many universities use the SAT as part of their admissions policy and a way of assessing merit-based scholarships for students. And so it's not that it is an invalid metric, although there's questions about whether it meets Kentucky's own accountability requirements. The bigger issue is why you would drop an assessment for which you have nearly 2 decades of data in favor of something for which you're starting over at scratch.
Gary, you mentioned the legality of this. The process wasn't followed by shifting to a different test. Are there any lawsuits on the horizon? There's a question of the legality. Is anybody?
None that I've heard of, but I would love for members of the state legislature to take this under consideration. And maybe if this Kentucky the Kentucky Board of Education isn't going to raise these questions, then I think it falls to the legislature to make inquiries about how this happened. And quite frankly, anecdotally, I've heard from many educators in the classroom who are deeply concerned about this. High school educators who, have long relied on the ACT as a means of assessing what their students need and how to respond to where their students currently are. They are now in a completely new situation with no baseline data for several years to begin to work with.
Yeah, so we will stay tuned and see if the state legislature picks this up next session. Perhaps they could pass a law and revert back to the ACT. They certainly have the authority to do that.
They do. It's difficult. The situation that the state gets in is if you dictate a particular test or vendor, those kinds of things change a lot over time, right? And so the state is always reluctant to dictate a specific vendor, but they definitely have the authority to provide more guidance to the Department of Education on what kinds of assessments that should be utilized. And so that's the approach I think that is probably most appropriate here.
Very good. In your column, Gary, you talked about Jackie Coleman's opposition to the federal education freedom tax credit. That was the federal school choice program where any taxpayer can write off $1,700 per year, where that's a complete write-off, and it would go to a grant-making organization, and then it would be distributed to students who fit within a certain threshold. She's opposed to that. Any clarity as to what would be the reason to oppose something like that?
Well, this is a really interesting issue because, of course, Governor Beshear has long been opposed to policies that empower ordinary families to make educational choices outside of the public school system. And as his sort of chief education bulldog, if you will, Lieutenant Governor Coleman has used her position as a bully pulpit to regularly denigrate school choice policies. And both of them played a key role in the defeat of Amendment 2 a couple of years ago, which would have opened the door to more school choice policies here in Kentucky. What was really interesting about this federal school choice program is that for the first time in the state legislature, we had more than a few Democrats vote yes to support this particular school choice program because Kentucky residents are already going to be eligible to receive the tax credit if they donate to one of these scholarships. What Lieutenant Governor Coleman and Governor Beshear were doing was trying to suggest that Kentucky students shouldn't get the benefit of those donations, even though Kentucky taxpayers were going to benefit. Those Kentucky taxpayers' scholarship dollars were going to go outside of the state. And so that created a bipartisan source of support for this federal scholarship tax credit program, which thankfully passed the legislature and was passed over the veto of Governor Beshear. And so the very rhetoric that Lieutenant Governor Coleman used in opposing this was not accurate in terms of representing what school choice policies actually do.
Gary, if I could jump in and just say this to add to that, put an exclamation point on it. She called it a voucher program, right?
Right. Right, which is completely inaccurate, and I have to believe that Lieutenant Governor Coleman it knows better to be able to distinguish between what a voucher program is versus a tax credit program. But she's going off of some polling that she's seen somewhere that voucher sounds bad to voters, and so that's the language she's using in a way that really misleads Kentuckians about what this opportunity meant for Kentucky families.
Gary, just a follow up here. Do you think that this is a game changer for Kentucky parents who don't have the resources to send their kids to private school, or maybe they want to homeschool? Is this going to be a game changer, or where are we with this?
Yeah, I think this is probably the most important school choice development in Kentucky's history, in particular because the public education establishment in the state has been so powerful and has essentially, manipulated the courts in a way that has locked Kentucky out of access to the kinds of school choice policies that have benefited students in almost every other state. Mm-hmm. This new federal program finally breaks through that wall that the education establishment built against Kentucky families, and now gives virtually every family in the state, the opportunity to access the same kinds of education options for their children that affluent families have always enjoyed. So it is definitely a game changer.
Gary, I just need to follow up, and we could do a whole program on school choice programs, but is this going to destroy public education? That's what we heard when the Amendment 2 issue was on the ballot. It's going to wreck our local public schools, right? You heard it too.
That's certainly what Governor Beshear and Lieutenant Governor Coleman tried to tell everybody. But if you just look at the experience of other states, you can see the utter falsehood of the idea that school choice destroys public education. When you look at other school choice rich states like Florida, for example, which has some of the oldest and highest levels of participation of school choice programs in the country, you find a state that is academically outperforming similar states like Kentucky, for example, and across a wide variety of demographics. And that includes students who are still being served in public schools in states like Florida, outperform Kentucky's public school students, just proving that ultimately school choice works well for every student.
Gary, we're running out of time, but I do want to point out, you talk about Kentucky education performance is deteriorating. You talk about the spending versus the performance gap. You need to say this, that despite significant increases in per pupil spending, Kentucky's NAEP, that's the National Association of Education Progress, in math and reading scores are lower today than they were a decade ago. What's going on in our classrooms? Why are we worse off today despite all the spending? We're told that more money equals better results. Clearly not the case here.
Yeah, and it's definitely not for lack of effort on the part of our public school teachers, who I believe the vast majority are going in and doing the best job they can every day. There are just structural barriers within the public education system for those dollars yielding a maximum impact. And so what we've seen as our spending on education has increased, more and more of those dollars have gone to expanded administrative jobs within the schools, and of course to supporting higher health insurance premiums for employees and to shore up our pension programs. So when teachers say, "I don't see those dollars come into my classroom," they're not mistaken. It's those dollars are being siphoned off into other bureaucratic dimensions of the public education system. And I think part of this is the misperception that spending more money automatically means you get higher levels of student achievement. That has just not proven to be universally true at any spending level. Research suggests that modest improvements in school funding yield modest increases in student performance, but there is a quick leveling off effect. The bottom line is that what brings about high levels of student learning is not directly connected to how much money is being spent within the school district. There are other variables and other factors that really come into play there. And so I think all of that is an explanation for why We're spending more, we're getting less for the dollars that we've invested. And meanwhile, we see a public education establishment that is rigidly opposed to any kind of structural change that might alter the trajectory that we're on here. And so it's part of why school choice is so important, is that it gives us another means of an alternative to the existing public education system that can put pressure on the public school system to.
Gary, we've got just a minute to go, and this is not enough time for you to answer this, but I want to talk about, since the column is about next year's governor's race and Jackie Coleman, how important is the governorship when it comes to ed policy in Kentucky?
Yeah, it's important, especially because of the the influence of the office itself. You know, Kentucky is a Republican supermajority state. Mm-hmm. And so if a critical mass of legislators want something to happen, they can do it and override a governor's veto. And so in that sense, the governor's probably not the most important player in this system. But the influence that the governor exerts in terms of being able to shape the public narrative is immense. And when I consider what we might have been able to do over recent years with a governor who really took school accountability seriously, who took student achievement seriously, who expected the education system to do better, it's quite remarkable the difference that would have made in the education policy in the Commonwealth in the last few years.
Very good. And on that note, Gary, we're going to have to close it out. Gary Houchens with the Bluegrass Institute. Always great to have you on the program. God bless you and keep up the good work.